The Bronze Age lasted for over 2,000 years, bringing forth the rise of powerful civilizations across the Near East. Small settlements who gradually evolved into bustling cities, home to grand palaces and towering monuments. Writing and art flourished, while trade routes extended from India to Britain, creating one of the earliest examples of globalization. A Babylonian king might sip fine Hittite wine, spiced with exotic flavors from India, from a bronze cup cast using Cypriot copper and Afghan tin. His queen might wear jewelry crafted from Baltic amber and dress in silk imported from China. Letters exchanged between Egyptian pharaohs and Hittite rulers reveal a fascinating world of ancient diplomacy, where kings sent envoys, traded lavish gifts, arranged marriages to secure alliances, offered advice, issued threats, and when words failed, waged war. Then, almost without warning, everything began to fall apart. Hundreds of cities were reduced to rubble, burned to the ground by fire, and torn apart by war. Some powerful kingdoms vanished entirely, while others managed to survive, only to be set back by centuries. In many regions, writing disappeared and culture withered. Those left living among the ruins could scarcely believe that the immense, now crumbling, structures around them had once been built by human hands. The chain of events that brought the Bronze Age world to its knees is known today as the Late Bronze Age collapse. When disasters happen, people often look for a single, simple explanation. An erupting volcano, a devastating war, a prolonged drought, a sweeping flood, or an invasion by barbarian tribes. But history is rarely that straightforward. No one cause alone could explain such widespread destruction. So, to truly understand what happened, we need to take a deeper look at how everything unraveled. Before the collapse, the Near East was dominated by several powerful states, foremost among them, Egypt. In the 16th century BC, the Egyptians expelled the Hyksos, foreign rulers who had controlled the region for nearly a century. This victory marked the rise of Egypt's new kingdom, with Thebes as its capital. Years of resistance had hardened Egypt, forging a skilled and powerful military class. Once independent, Egyptian forces advanced into Canaan and Syria, pushing all the way to the Euphrates, where Pharaoh Thutmose erected a stele to mark his conquests. But instead of simply demanding tribute from the conquered cities, he left behind military garrisons and appointed officials to govern in his name, ensuring Egypt's control for generations. The wealth pouring in from these new territories ushered in a golden age. Art, sculpture, and architecture flourished, while Egypt's trade and military dominance became stronger than ever. The pharaohs who followed, especially the grandson of Thutmose, Amenhotep III, fought relentlessly to expand and secure their influence throughout the Near East. Their greatest rivals were the kingdom of Mitanni and the Syro-Hittite city-states of Syria and the Levant. During this era, Egypt rose as the first true superpower of the Bronze Age. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, Assyria was on the rise. The decline of Mitanni, caught between Egyptian and Hittite expansion, along with internal struggles in Kassite Babylonia, created the perfect opportunity. Under King Ashur-uballit-vushprisa, the Assyrians launched successful campaigns against neighboring states and earned recognition from both Egypt and Babylon. Positioned at the crossroads of key trade routes, Assyria rapidly transformed into a wealthy and formidable force. From the 17th to the 13th century BC, the Hittites ruled over Anatolia. However, their kingdom wasn't a unified empire. At the top stood the Labarna, or Hattushili, the supreme king, viewed as first among equals. He ruled alongside other kings and princes who held significant independent power. Each of these rulers commanded their own battle-hardened forces. During successful campaigns, the aristocracy rallied around the supreme king and joined his conquests. In return, they received land, spoils, and slaves. The regions conquered by the Hittites became quasi-independent states, with cities required to pay tribute. But when military campaigns failed, the unity within the kingdom began to unravel. Internal power struggles and assassinations were common. In fact, more than half of the Hittite kings met untimely deaths, many through murder. The kingdom was surrounded by a patchwork of vassal states, populated by a mix of Hittites, Luwians, and early Greeks. The largest of these vassals were Arzawa, Hatiwa, Luka, Isuwa, and Wilusa, better known from Homeric legend as Troy. These states allied with the Hittites during wartime and, in return, received military protection. The Hittites' primary geopolitical goal was to dominate the trade crossroads in Syria, near the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This would give them direct access to the riches of the Levant and Mesopotamia. But standing in the way of their expansion was the kingdom of Mitanni, already under pressure from both the Assyrians and the Egyptians. By the early 13th century BC, Mitanni could no longer withstand the might of its neighbors and collapsed. This collapse triggered a direct confrontation between the Hittites and Egyptians. The ambitions of these two superpowers collided. The Hittites aimed to expand southward, while the Egyptians were determined to push north. Both empires also turned their eyes east, where they encountered the rising power of Assyria. Border skirmishes among the three powers became common, eventually culminating in a major showdown. The armies of Hittite. King Muwatalli II and Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II met in battle near the city of Kadesh. It was one of the largest chariot battles in history. The fighting was intense, but neither side emerged with a decisive victory. Both suffered heavy losses. Although the Egyptians held the battlefield by the end, their army was too battered and exhausted to advance or take Kadesh, its primary objective. Soon after the battle, the world's first recorded peace treaty was signed between the Hittites and Egyptians. This effectively ended Egypt's ambitions to move north and created a temporary halt to full-scale warfare. Yet even after the Battle of Kadesh, peace remained fragile. While the treaty brought diplomatic recognition and short-term stability, tensions among Egypt, the Hittite Empire, and Assyria lingered. Kadesh itself changed hands multiple times in the years that followed, but no single power achieved lasting dominance. Meanwhile, in the Aegean, the Minoan civilization flourished for centuries on Crete and surrounding islands. The Minoans built grand, unfortified cities, worshipped bulls and a mother goddess, and featured women in public life, often depicted with exposed breasts. Their seafaring culture stretched across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Egypt. The Minoans were among the first to dominate the seas, using advanced shipbuilding and a network of strategic outposts to control vital trade routes. This gave them not only great wealth, but considerable political influence. Their dominance was powered by their geography and maritime innovation. But in the 16th century BC, disaster struck. A massive volcanic eruption rocked the island of Thera in the Aegean Sea. The blast was so immense, it equaled the power of 200,000 Hiroshima-level atomic bombs. Millions of tons of volcanic ash were blasted into the air, and massive tsunamis, with waves as high as 100 meters, spread from the eruption's epicenter. This cataclysmic event caused widespread devastation across the eastern Mediterranean. But for the Minoans, it nearly marked the end of their civilization. In just a single day, their entire naval fleet was destroyed, and their coastal cities were left in ruins. The Minoans never fully recovered from the disaster and were eventually conquered by a new civilization rising from mainland Greece, the Mycenaeans. While the exact ethnicity of the Minoans remains a mystery, their language still undeciphered. We do know their successors, the Mycenaeans, were ancestors of the ancient Greeks and spoke an early form of the Greek language. The Mycenaeans inherited much of the Minoan culture and achievements. In a remarkably short time, their civilization spread throughout the Aegean islands and into Ionia, founding cities like Athens, Tiryns, Mycenae, Pylos, Miletus, and Euboea. The Mycenaeans, or Achaeans, as they called themselves, never formed a unified state. Unlike the centralized kingdoms of the Near East, they developed small, independent city-states, each separated by natural barriers such as mountains, rivers, and seas. Unlike the peaceful Minoans, the Achaeans were fierce warriors, often in conflict with one another. Their cities were protected by massive stone walls, built to withstand both invaders and rival states. At sea, however, they failed to replicate the Minoans' powerful maritime empire. The sea refused to yield to them. In time, the Phoenicians rose as the dominant naval power. Meanwhile, the Achaeans turned to piracy and raiding, practices that were both familiar and profitable. Back in Asia Minor, the Hittite Empire began to unravel. Internal divisions deepened as conquered peoples rebelled, and provincial aristocrats grew increasingly defiant. Eventually, the supreme king Mursili III was overthrown and fled to Egypt. Leading the revolt was his uncle, Hattusili, who had once commanded Hittite forces at the Battle of Kadesh. What followed was a period of unending civil conflict. Hittite culture and art declined, and their architecture grew noticeably simpler. Many regions on the empire's fringes broke away entirely. At the same time, a prolonged and severe drought struck Asia Minor, peaking in the late 13th to early 12th centuries BC. Famine spread across Greece and the Hittite realm. Even Egypt and Mesopotamia, though less affected, struggled with food shortages. The desperate Hittites pleaded for aid, and the Egyptian pharaoh responded, sending ships filled with grain. However, Egypt was facing shortages of its own, so the aid it could provide barely made a difference. A harsh famine struck Crete, which had always depended on imported grain. But with supplies running low everywhere, there was simply nowhere left to buy what was needed. Arzawa, Kidzuwatna, Ugarit, Isuwa, and Troy all fell out of the Hittite sphere of influence. With the Hittites distracted by growing internal problems, armed conflicts began to erupt between their former satellite states. These clashes were not new, but they intensified. The Luca people, in particular, had long been known as aggressive raiders and pirates. In the past, Hittite kings had mediated disputes among their vassals and provided military support when necessary. But now, without Hittite backing, regions like Arzawa, Alasia, and Kidzuwatna suffered constant attacks from both the Achaeans and the Luca. Assyria, too, was entering a time of unrest. Around the same time as the Battle of Kadesh, Tukulti-Ninurta rose to power in Assyria. Recognizing the weakness of the Hittites, he launched aggressive campaigns to seize control of critical trade routes. However, his greatest victories were in the south. In 1223 BC, he conquered Babylonia. In Assyria itself, Tukulti-Ninurta built a new city called Kar Tukulti-Ninurta, meaning Tukulti-Ninurta's trade port. He planned to move the capital there and shift the empire's religious focus to the god Ashur. This decision angered both the aristocracy, who relied on trade flowing through the old capital, and the priesthood, which resisted religious reform. A revolt broke out, and Tukulti-Ninurta was assassinated. After his death, Assyria fell into a period of decline and internal power struggles. Taking advantage of the instability, the Babylonians rose up and reclaimed their independence. Egypt, meanwhile, faced growing external threats. Although it managed to maintain internal stability and preserve central authority, it couldn't exploit the weakening of its neighbors. Egypt was beset by raids from the Libyans in the west and the Nubians in the south. The pharaoh's army was stretched thin, struggling to respond. Simultaneously, uprisings and revolts erupted in Canaan. Egypt had just enough strength to maintain its territories, but only barely. By around 1200 BC, Syria and northern Mesopotamia had become a war-torn wasteland. The vital trade routes that once linked the great Bronze Age civilizations were now lawless and unsafe. Assyria was torn by civil war. Egypt was overwhelmed by rebellion and raiding. The Hittites were plagued by internal collapse, and Babylonia, having suffered under Assyrian conquest and Elamite raids, was left devastated. These conditions made travel and commerce across the region extremely dangerous. Trade, which had sustained these civilizations for centuries, came to a standstill. To make matters worse, prolonged droughts and crop failures struck hard. When a society can't feed its own people, selling grain becomes impossible, and the food crisis spread quickly and relentlessly. This led to the complete collapse of international trade and further plunged the Near Eastern states into decline. It was during this time of growing instability that waves of migration began. A large group of tribes, stretching from the Danube to the Balkans, began moving south and east. Among them were the Dorians, ancestors of the future Spartans, who invaded Greece, triggering a crisis that eventually led to the fall of the Mycenaean civilization. In a short time, the Dorians conquered the entire Peloponnese. Joining forces with the Achaeans, they first raided Crete and the Aegean Islands, then launched attacks into Asia Minor. One of the most well-known events from this migration period is the Trojan War, famously described by Homer, during which the Dorians and Achaeans destroyed the city of Troy. At the same time, the Phrygians, distant relatives of the Dorians, moved south from the northern Balkans into Asia Minor. They were soon joined by the Casca people, migrating from the southern coast of the Black Sea. Together, they quickly overwhelmed the Hittite kingdom, eventually destroying its capital, Hattusa. A major reason for the success of the Dorian and Phrygian invasions was their widespread use of iron weapons. This wasn't because iron was better than bronze. In fact, bronze weapons were of higher quality. But bronze was expensive and relied on two rare materials: copper and tin. Iron, on the other hand, was much more abundant, occurring naturally at rates 10 times higher than copper and 100 times higher than tin. Because of this, arming a large army with bronze became economically impossible, while iron offered a cheaper and more accessible alternative. In the Bronze Age, only aristocrats and elite infantry units could afford bronze armor and weapons. Most foot soldiers were poorly equipped and barely trained. The dominant force on ancient battlefields was the chariot, a mobile platform for archers. Battles often played out with chariot units maneuvering and firing at range. Whoever could build and operate the most chariots usually had the upper hand. Infantry units mainly consisted of archers and slingers. But as iron weapons became more available, the primary battlefield tools shifted to swords and spears. Though iron weapons were of lower quality, there were enough to arm vast numbers of troops. This marked a turning point. The small, elite armies of the Bronze Age could not match the larger, iron-armed forces now emerging. Now let's step back and look at the broader picture. The collapse of the Bronze Age is often linked to the invasion of the so-called Sea Peoples. Many imagine this as a single massive invasion that swept in and destroyed everything. Some of you might be thinking, all right, the Sea Peoples are coming. That's when the collapse happens. But in reality, the collapse was already well underway. The Sea Peoples were just one part of a much larger and ongoing crisis, even though we haven't mentioned them by name until now. So, who were the Sea Peoples? And what role did they play in the Bronze Age collapse? The term Sea Peoples is modern. It was coined by 19th century French archaeologist Emmanuel de Rouget to describe a series of groups that attacked Egypt by sea during the 13th and 12th centuries BC. Egyptian records provide several names for these invaders: Carcassa, Luca, Shurdan, Ekwesh, Shekelesh, Teresh, Denyen, Peleset, Cheker, Weshesh, and Meshwesh. Some of these groups are better understood than others. The Luca have already been mentioned. The Peleset are widely believed to be the biblical Philistines, a Greek-speaking people. The Ekwesh and Denyen were likely the Achaeans and Danaaeans of Homeric legend. Others are more speculative. The Sherden and Shekelesh are often linked to the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, where the Sardinians and Sicans lived. The Teresh may be connected to the Trojans, Etruscans, or the people of Tarsus, but these links are based largely on name similarities. Some of these groups appear in records even before the Bronze Age collapse. They were known as fierce, seafaring tribes, often engaged in piracy and raiding. Interestingly, some even fought as mercenaries for the great powers of the time. During the Battle of Kadesh, for instance, Sherden warriors fought for Egypt, while the Luca and Carcassa supported the Hittites. But as the empires weakened, these seaborne raiders grew more aggressive, launching frequent attacks on coastal cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The first major assault on Egypt occurred around 1207 BC, during the 5th year of Pharaoh Merneptah's reign. Joined by Libyan forces, the Ekwesh, Sherden, Luca, and others attacked from the west. Merneptah's army mounted a strong defense, capturing many of the invaders. Evidence of these attacks also comes from diplomatic letters. One exchange between the king of Ugarit and the Hittite king references the Shekelesh, likely described as people who live on ships. Another letter from the king of Alasaya complains to Pharaoh Akhenaten about constant raids by the Luca. So, what's going on here? The combination of warfare, drought, and famine in Asia Minor and Greece triggered a massive wave of refugees and migrants, people desperate for survival and willing to fight for a better life. These migrants included Trojans, Hittites, Mycenaeans, native peoples from the Aegean Islands, and others displaced by the Dorian and Phrygian invasions. They gathered in southern Anatolia, once part of the Hittite Empire, and then began migrating toward areas they believed were safer: Syria, Canaan, and Egypt. Naturally, the local populations did not welcome them, leading to bloody and prolonged conflicts. This period was also marked by constant raids from the sea peoples along the Mediterranean coastline. Pharaoh Ramses III famously described these events in vivid detail on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu. According to the inscriptions, the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Keita, Kod, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia being cut off at one time. He continued, a camp was set up in one place in Amuru. They devastated its people, and its land was like that which had never come into being. They were advancing toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation included the Peliset, Shurdan, Shekelesh, Danuna, and Weshesh, lands united. They laid their hands on every land within reach, confident and full of trust. In 1175 BC, Ugarit, one of the largest trade hubs of its time, fell. We learn about the city's fate from a clay tablet that contains a desperate letter sent by the ruler of Ugarit to the king of Alashia. The letter reads, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luka? Thus, the country is left to fend for itself. May my father know this. The 7 enemy ships that came here caused great destruction." The clay tablet was discovered inside a kiln where it had been placed for firing, but never retrieved. Evidence that the city was overrun before the message could be sent. The only force capable of halting the advance of the sea peoples and the migrating populations was Egypt. The decisive battles took place in 1175 BC. First, Ramses III's forces defeated the invaders on land, stopping their forward momentum. Then, he lured the Sea People's fleet into the Nile Delta, where he sprung a trap. Egyptian ships blocked their escape, while infantry forces ambushed them from the shore. Even after this, the migrations did not stop. The Peliset settled near the city of Gaza. Today, we know them as the biblical Philistines, and it is from their name that the modern term Palestine is derived. The defeated Shurdan, Shekelesh, and possibly the Teresh migrated westward into the central Mediterranean, eventually settling in Sardinia, Sicily, and northern Italy. Meanwhile, the Israelites arrived in Canaan, though most likely not from Egypt. The historicity of the biblical Exodus is considered highly questionable by most modern scholars. Many researchers associate the origins of the Israelites with the Habiru, a loosely connected group of people who lived in the mountainous and semi-desert regions east of Canaan. Around the same time, Aramean tribes migrated into the devastated lands of Syria, filling the vacuum left by the collapse of once powerful kingdoms. Despite Egypt's military success in defending its borders, the loss of Canaan and Syria, along with the breakdown of trade and economic networks, was a catastrophic blow. Egypt would never fully recover its former power or reach. The new kingdom began a steady decline, weakened by both external threats and internal instability. Assyria and Babylon also entered periods of decline, though they were largely spared from the most destructive battles. The surrounding chaos and economic disruption took a heavy toll Their weakened states left them vulnerable to future invasions and internal power struggles. Greece and Asia Minor descended into what historians often describe as a true dark age. Cities were abandoned, literacy disappeared, and art and architecture all but vanished for centuries. So, what caused the collapse of these great Bronze Age civilizations? There is no single answer. It was a combination of interconnected factors, none of which, on their own, would have been enough to bring down entire civilizations. But together, they created a perfect storm. Severe droughts led to crop failures and famine. Maritime piracy and large-scale invasions disrupted sea trade. Prolonged warfare weakened even the most powerful empires. Internal conflicts fractured governments and divided societies. Most importantly, the collapse of long-established international trade networks severed the economic lifelines that had held the Bronze Age world together. These civilizations had become too interconnected, too dependent on fragile systems of diplomacy, commerce, and tribute. When those systems failed, the entire structure crumbled. This wasn't just a fall. It was a disintegration. Cities were burned. Knowledge was lost. People migrated in search of safety and survival. And all of it, this monumental collapse, happened not in a single moment, but in waves of destruction, displacement, and decline. Heat. The collapse of the Bronze Age reminds us how fragile even the most advanced civilizations can be when faced with multiple, interconnected crises: climate change, economic disruption, conflict, and migration. Today, we face similar challenges: global warming, unstable supply chains, political divisions, and mass displacement. The lesson is clear. Resilience comes from adaptability, cooperation, and diversification. We must invest in sustainable systems, value diplomacy over aggression, and reduce our dependence on fragile networks. Prepare for the unexpected by strengthening local communities, building strong alliances, and never assuming stability is permanent. History doesn't repeat, but it does warn those willing to listen.